Well, hello to the Inverted podcast. Today it's a bit of a special episode because we're missing Jeroen and Tom, who have been held hostage by their day-to-day corporate jobs, and probably Dana is fighting with his coffee machine as it's 6 o'clock in the morning on his side. Maybe we'll see him. But we have a guest, so that's great. Dexter, thanks for being in our podcast, and maybe you introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So my name's Dexter Awoyemi. I work as an independent AI systems architect, transformation partner, mainly working in regulated environments. My focus is on something that I call clarity before code, which is mapping intent, risk, obligations, and behavior before actually building the AI system. And the recent work that got us talking was my turning the EU AI Act into an executable knowledge graph so that teams can use it to reason about their obligations in a structured manner rather than trying to read through a PDF.
Exactly.
So it's
well, thanks.
a tool for cross-team alignment.
Well, cool. Yeah, and that's exactly what what caught my eye, because as we talk about inverted problems in here, like where problems are, where success is when nothing happens, and we have compliance to regulatory frameworks, and like in this case, the AI regulatory frameworks that are coming up in Europe are certainly one of them. Like if you're not compliant, if you're compliant, you will have fewer signals. And then I found it really interesting, your approach of helping people understand how do regulatory requirements even translate into what people have to do, and help them understand. I think one thing you wrote in the LinkedIn post, which we'll add to the show notes, is that people don't have time to read the 500-page documents. And if I look at myself, like sometimes I get myself to read long documents, but then it's really hard to translate them into actual work. How does it impact my daily work? How do I make day-to-day decisions based on those, on something that is so extensive as a regulatory thing? So I wonder, how do you see AI regulatory changes affect the way like product teams actually build products, and maybe in general, how do they build product? How does it affect them on a day-to-day basis?
So I think for AI in particular, it's quite interesting because teams tend to default to wanting to use AI almost to do the work for them, which is, I mean, fair in some sense, because AI it allows you to do work a lot more efficiently. Yeah. But I find that a lot of the ways that people typically implement AI into their workflows is often like the most kind of naive way of using it, which is to try and just offload all of the work. Like you kind of just like dump all the information in. And I think for needle in the haystack type work, where a needle in the haystack being a task where you're trying to find some specific information within a corpus of text. I think AI is pretty good at that and scores, I think, almost 100% on benchmarks for that kind of task. But if you're trying to understand like the narrative within a document, so there's a interesting benchmark. Actually, I think it's Fiction Live Bench that measures kind of like AI understanding of the narrative of novels. And AI isn't always good at that. So really, I think the approach to using AI to understand things like regulations needs some thoughtful consideration, because otherwise, I think treating all tasks the same with AI is kind of like a foot gun for a lot of people. When it comes to AI regulation and building products, I think the ideal kind of outcome is for the classification to start at the beginning of the design rather than later. So a lot of conversations around building products, especially products that leverage AI, end up being conversations about what model to use, what agent frameworks to implement, rather than starting with like the classification of risk for that particular product, and all the considerations that need to be made around like human in the loop is often kind of an afterthought or isn't really
Mm-hmm.
considered as part of the system design. But the way that I see it is that human in the loop to date, and I see it for at least like the next few years, I would bet, but I'm not entirely sure. The AI keeps getting better and better at like being able to monitor and plan and manage its own work
Yeah.
recursively. But I think human in the loop is a non-negotiable and has been a non-negotiable. I think it's always been part of the system. There was a US Department of Defense study from 2012 where they were investigating like levels of autonomy within their systems, and their conclusion was something like all systems have like different levels of autonomy. It's a spectrum, but there's always like some kind of human control, and it's just about like how much human control, where the human control gets added,
Yeah.
that kind of determines like how humans interact with these autonomous systems. But ultimately, there's always some kind of human aspect to it. And it was an interesting finding, I think, or an interesting part of the EU AI Act is the fact that they have human oversight as a requirement within the regulations. Yet there isn't really much kind of like consideration about the fact that this, like, it's a requirement, is something that you potentially have to prove or show, and maybe it goes the way of like GDPR and complying with GDPR. I think the most thoughtful implementations of GDPR compliance have very easy to access like data controls, like within settings. You
Mm-hmm.
can export your data, you can request for your data to be deleted. It's built into the technology. So it's not like a pain for somebody to have to go and implement later that then becomes expensive for the company. So the short-sightedness can definitely be a hindrance for companies down the line. And I think it
Yeah.
potentially matches with the philosophy of inverted product, where it's the kind of thing that you don't really consider because it doesn't have like the clearest upside, but like you'll end up paying
Yeah.
for it like later down the line in quite an asymmetric way, because a lot of the GDPR requests I remember quite infamously used to be expensive for, for a lot of companies, especially if you don't have it built in. Then it can become quite tricky to then retrieve that data and prove that you've actually removed somebody's information from your system, or yeah, or I forget what the other one is now. So it's a removal and also giving a dump to the user
Yeah.
of
Retrieval
all
or
of
yeah.
the data that you have in them,
Okay.
subject access requests.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it's a critical one. That I think that's one that people often forget when it comes to GDPR is the importance of giving people full access to the information one has. You mentioned the human in the loop. I find that a fascinating conversation these days, because when I look at like, we're still early phase of even generative AI. We're still not in early phase of AI as a subject overall, but like a generative AI, automation of workflows. We're still in relatively early days, and I think people start to, or have been in the beginning, starting to think that human in the loop is the one that just checks for errors, like looks at the output and then looks at, well, is this correct or not? Do we see in regulatory requirements or in your best practices also the place where the human in the loop is the one that generates the clarity on what the AI actually has to do and verifies that? Because you mentioned clarity before, and I think clarity is something we've discussed also in this podcast previously. Like, the clearer you are about what the problem is you want to solve, the fewer possible solutions there are. And I think that's where AI tends to be weak, is in implying clarity. how do you see clarity being given to AI by human in the loop? And yeah, that's just a
I,
question.
I'm a big fan of the topic of human in the loop, and like what it all the things that intersect with the human in the loop aspect of agentic systems, especially because I think people often think about the errors and handling the errors, and humans like dealing with the mess or mitigating risk
Yeah.
of AI not being able to solve a thing. But I think the user experience actually, the crux is within how humans interact with the system, because when you map out how a system works, often you're delegating decisions, and those decision nodes, the hardest decisions, I think, or the most impactful decisions that you make in system design for that type of system is which decisions you delegate to the model and which you delegate to a human. And
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, any any outcome that the human user, and you have internal or human in the loops patterns that like inward looking, like that are internal to the people managing the system, and that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like where all the error handling and compliance kind of lives. And then the user experience like adjusts depending on how you implement the human in the loop within an agentic system for both the users of the system and the people managing the system. I think you have to very intentionally design those human in the loop patterns, because it it impacts like who it is that made a decision,
Yeah.
and the auditability of that. It also, so there are like a bunch of different custom kind of human in the loop patterns I've built. One of them is was for a customer support agent, and it was entirely custom built. And the human in the loop within a chatbot experience is just us as the user. So, for example, I'm using ChatGPT. I'm the human in the loop that's prompting the model. Even if the model is like working potential like one overarching goal, and I'm like injecting the context that I think is relevant. I'm
Mm-hmm.
giving steering to kind of like align it with like what I believe the goal is, and as my understanding improves, like I get more clarity, and then that's how you get this kind of like collaborative back and forth with the AI. But those human in loop patterns, they often end up looking. They can. There are there's so many different like ways that we interact with the AI, and a lot of the kind of user experience that we're now seeing with developer tooling, and also now with like Claude Co-work, which extends it out of the world of developers and also into the hands of regular users, or at least power users, because I think you need to be on the max plan at least. Is that the AI will also ask you questions, and then you'll have to give it the context that it's requesting from you. And
Okay. Yeah.
so yeah, you have human in the loop that enables clarity, enables like auditability, liability, and also just general kind of like user experience and how a product feels. Yeah, so there's a lot to human in the loop, and I think it's one of the most important parts of building an effective agentic AI system.
When we're looking at like human in the loop in the context of meeting regulatory requirements, like inward facing, like if I build a product, or the people who are listening to this and want to build a product, maybe either a new one or build AI on top of their existing product, what are there any like check boxes they need to think about? Are there process that they need to establish in order to implement the human in the loop in the right way? Like, what are the responsibilities in regards to when that human has to be involved? Like, how fast do they need to respond to potential issues? To look at, not just to improve quality over the long time, but also to look at potential incidents that could have been caused by AI agents. Like, are there best practices that have already been established there?
I find it hard to point to best practices, given how new all of this is,
Yeah.
and how much it's changing. But I've definitely tackled it in a number of different ways, and I think this keeps evolving. So on the so you're more interested in like the inward human in the loop for like compliance
Well, I think in this
and
question,
oversight.
yes. If you look at the
Yeah.
inwards part, but it will also be interesting then in the second part on the outwards part, and maybe around reporting responsibilities. But if we're
Mhm.
looking at the inward part, it's probably the ones that people might have to think about first while they're building the product.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you definitely want to have the insights of what it is that the models are generating. Like, observability has to be built in from the beginning in order for you to be able to track how the system is responding to usage. And I'm not sure if it comes second to other human in the loop patterns. Like, I think it's all complementary, just because the system itself might need the human using the AI to, well, it will need the human using the AI to drive like the outcome. Um, but for somebody managing an AI system, I'm trying to think of useful examples, because often if you deploy a system, you're monitoring logs, or you have it hooked up to some provider um, of a platform that gives you like traceability of
Hmm.
what's happening within the system. But I think how you end up designing a workflow for people to improve the system will also depend a lot on the internal kind of uh, set of tooling and the objective of the system itself. Because ultimately, all of these systems are designed to drive some particular kind of outcome
Yeah.
and behavioral change in some downstream system. And I think that's going to be the most informative thing once you have that clearly defined. Like, what behavior is it that we're trying to change? What does failure look like? Um, what are the failure modes? And it's a less than, or it's an annoying answer, but it kind of is one of those it depends kind of situations, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And that absolutely makes sense. Um, like currently, with a lot of the conversations around problems with generative AI. I mean, last weeks or so, a lot of people have been talking about image generation, like how like X as a platform doesn't take responsibility for the outcomes of the image generation. Um,
Mm.
do you see human in the loop, or do you see there opportunities, or maybe missed opportunities that companies that offer services like this have to take in order to be clearer about what type of outcome they want, but also maybe what type of outcome they don't want to have? Because I think that's where obviously the discourse is focusing on.
Yeah, so you wouldn't want to have human in the loop on every image generation, because then you'd have to have and a whole bunch of people just constantly monitoring the
Sure.
images, and I guess it could work, but it would defeat the purpose in some sense. But having having oversight over the types of images that are generated. I think it all just points to conventional software, and like at that point, because it's, you know, you need good monitoring, you need to um, have a good view of the images that are being generated, and the way that people are using the system in general. I think what AI enables is for the process of building like bespoke interfaces for looking at what is being done within a system.
Yeah.
It just supercharges that, and makes it like really really quick and easy to build very bespoke experiences for internal staff to be able to keep track of things that the company is responsible for.
When maybe going back a bit more to the regulatory part, like the AI regulatory part that you've been looking in, and when you work with customers and clients, like where do you see the biggest challenges in people understanding the details of those regulatory frameworks?
I think there hasn't been much there hasn't been much focus, I think, from early stage startups on regulations. And I don't think that's ever been I think that's always the case with
Mhm.
startups is regulations are kind of like either an enabler for the business itself, or a secondary consideration that is going to come to bite them at some point when they need to be compliant to prove to the people they're selling to. And then on the other extreme, you have these large enterprises who have what one of my clients referred to as these AI centers of excellence, but they're effectively these committees. I've had these AI committees turn up in the middle of some of the projects that I've worked on before, and they are often driven by this need, this very legitimate need within enterprises to be compliant, and to also
Mhm.
have a well understood, I guess, security um, uh, design that applies across AI systems. And they always kind of converge on very similar or overlapping kind of designs where you have guard railing on the inputs and the outputs. You have this interfacing with whatever if they're actually I guess it depends. Sorry, it's the protection of people's personal data. It's authentication, access control, guard railing on the inputs and the outputs. So there is a need within large companies to be compliant and to be secure.
Mhm.
Um, so you end up with this blend of needs that come from the compliance teams and the security teams that come into whichever department within a company is who takes responsibility for these things, and that's often where it appears. But unfortunately, um, those conversations don't always happen at the right time, and in my experience, have always happened later than I think you'd ideally want them to happen, uh, because the the implementation has usually started well before anybody from compliance or security has had some kind of input. And often the engineering and product teams don't have a clear understanding of the company's compliance needs.
Yeah. So
So
how can product teams, engineering teams engage earlier on? Like, what are the best ways to do that? Like, when is too early, or what are the ways to engage in the right stage with these teams, with the compliance teams, to get the most out of them? And as you say, like clarity before code. How do you get the clarity on something that you haven't built yet?
I think that is very good question, and I am not entirely sure that I know the answer. I think it's something like we have shift left, or this concept of shift left in software development, where
Mhm.
often we're talking about security shifting left.
Yeah.
And I think maybe if if teams truly embraced a shift left culture, then perhaps that converges on taking all of the compliance considerations in early as well, because often we see it in software development at least. That I think there's a tendency to see compliance as documentation and a box checking exercise. And this is part
Mhm.
of what motivates me to turn the EU AI Act into a knowledge graph, is because actually it's better to see uh, these regulations as ontologies or as process maps or something that can be described in terms of actors, triggers, obligations, rather than having to try and like pass through some text. So um, yeah. So what was the question? I got
Yeah, I'm
distracted
just
thinking about the EU AI Act.
I'm just curious how what can we give people on the way that are in that situation where they're starting to build something, but they don't know yet enough about what they're building to have a clear questionnaire, but they want to involve the these competence like lacking a word, like these teams, like the compliance team, to really have them involved early on. I mean, we see them in so many in product development. We see them in so many areas, like involve product designers early in order to build better products. Involve sales earlier in order to build products that can actually sell. Like, so why should it be? It shouldn't be different with compliance, but often in large companies, compliance teams, even in the process, they see themselves as being the guard keeper from flipping the launch button. How do you get these compliance team away from being the ones that decide if something can be launched or not to be an integral partner in early stage of the process of building something new?
I think there's like a psychological challenge or something to overcome there, because um, thinking about the EU AI Act in particular, they
Mhm.
have specific clauses or phrases around human oversight and the need for human oversight within AI systems, as an example. And people don't think about the human oversight, but it's actually written within the regulations that you need to have human oversight in some way, shape, or form. And that maps very cleanly onto this idea of a human in the loop being
Yeah.
built into the product. And I think it's a constraint, but it's not like this limitation on how good the product can be. If anything, it just gives you the direction for you to stay compliant and to build a good product. Because these regulations are designed in a way that actually protects people and protects systems and organizations and society. And so it's kind of like a broken thinking to see them as a pain. And there is something in the way that I think that people interact within organizations, or have a tendency often to interact within organizations, that makes it feel like I've definitely felt this, or gotten this impression myself, and I don't know how much of it is just like a biased thought that I had in my mind, but of kind of like this person with a clipboard, uh, having like a sense of authority to use and wield, rather than but I don't necessarily blame the person. I kind of think that like the way that incentives are oriented within organizations creates these environments that aren't necessarily conducive to building good, thoughtful products. Um, and I think that these regulations, they're there for a reason. They serve a good purpose, and the the more accessible, I guess, we can make them for people. Hopefully, that gets to inform people how to make good products. I think
Yeah.
that are actually but beneficial, not just to society as a whole, but to them as an organization.
I really like that that approach of looking at that from. I mean, the problem is certainly multi-level, multi-layered. I mean, I remember in my time spending time in large organizations, and you build and build, and like the security team in the end needs to give their thumbs up or thumbs down if you can publish an app on the App Store, or if you can launch the website, or if you can launch an update. And one element that I also found was the staffing often doesn't allow them to be engaged earlier in the in an earlier stage, like security or also compliance. Like they're often so thinly staffed that they can only join product. They can only focus on fixing the fires, like preventing bad things from happening. And usually that's when you launch. Like nothing bad usually happens, or the risk of something bad happening before you launch is usually smaller, is significantly smaller than after you launch. So I think that's where also people are being forced into just focus on where they have the most immediate impact. And that's one of the things that fascinated me about that work you wrote about with creating a graph based on the AI regulations that helps more people interact with it and get knowledge out of it, and that might also reduce the workload for the specialist and being able to deliver value where it's most effective, rather than just be always the ones that has to be like prevent things from launching. Do you see that with more and more regulations, companies that you work with are increasing the staff, are increasing the capacity of these specialists, or are they still massively underfunded and understaffed and have to chase the most urgent fires all the time?
Definitely feels like the latter. I don't feel like I see an increase in the number of people working within compliance. Feels it feels like companies hire them when they feel that they need to. Uh, Sometimes that can be late, but I don't. I don't think people necessarily. To your earlier point, like I don't think they're necessarily uh, avoiding responsibility or trying to circumvent compliance or anything malicious. I think it really is just
Mhm.
a matter of like what is the priority for a lot of companies, and it really is often just to survive to either the next fundraising or whatever the next milestone is. Um, it is hard to put a value on compliance, but I am hopeful that uh, because AI enables the development of these tools and interacting with information um, in the way that it does, that it becomes easier to reason about these things, and for whatever it's worth, maybe the conversation becomes less friction when the work to understand how these regulations affect the systems that we design. Yeah, understanding that impact, if it becomes easier, then I hope, or at least I think that's
Yeah.
the best I can do is hope that AI is actually going to make that easier for teams.
Interesting. So maybe to close down, like what are the things you what are things you recommend product teams who want to understand better how they can learn more about compliance, especially now like thinking about the AI compliance requirements that are coming up. Like, where do they start? What should they look at? And also, what are the most important points they need to understand about AI regulation here in Europe?
Yeah, so I think where to start is which classification the system that you're working on falls under.
Mhm.
So is it high risk, limited risk, and for European companies, I mean, it affects everyone. So I think it, whether or not you're in Europe, I think this regulation and these types of regulations are going to set the trend or become the default for governance, similar to how GDPR did.
Mhm.
And so, by being compliant today with the EU AI Act, I think you're um, potentially saving yourself a lot of hassle down the line. Similar to if you were to design your system to have good data controls, as we were talking about earlier in the conversation.
Cool. Well, thanks. So I hear like taking away, I mean, for myself, but also probably people who listen, a understand where you stand with those within those regulations, like assessment, like risk classifications. We talk about that often in security, in privacy. There's a lot of, I think you always need to know what could go wrong and where do you stand in that, and then also maybe a bit of a reassurance or some peace of mind that what you're doing now for the EU AI Act is unlikely to be throwaway work, because following regulatory requirements or bodies will go and use that as a reference. I think that's something that we certainly have learned from GDPR. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I should caveat that I'm not a lawyer, so all of this is none of this is legal advice.
I think that's always a good. Yeah, I don't know how many conversations I start with. I'm not a lawyer. Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is not legal advice. This is just our view on how do we think people will have to navigate. And I think more and more. I mean, we see that more and more companies that are building things that used to be quote unquote non-regulated, just that doesn't exist anymore. Like nowadays, almost everything you build, you're going to be regulated, and maybe we can do a follow-up as the Cyber Resilience Act is coming up. I'm sure you're thinking about that in some areas that is going to affect even more people. Like not even just companies that make AI, but I mean even a USB stick will somehow be part of the Cyber Resilience Act, and so this mindset of building products that are not just cheap or not just good, whatever good means, but also need to prevent harm to society, to their customers and employees. I think that mindset has to establish much more with all types of organizations, while in the past it was banks and insurances and health companies that were forced to think about that. Great.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much, Dexter, for being here. Thank you also for just handling the unusual situation. It's just the two of us this time. But yeah, well, thank you so much, and hope we'll have to have you another episode where we talk about some other topics that are dear to your heart and you're working on. And everybody else, visit us on invertedpm.com, where you see all the episodes that have been published so far. We also sometimes write blog posts or translate the conversations we have in these posts about into posts into written form for people who that's easier. Thank you so much, and well, yeah, then I'll close the podcast and see you next time.